Cold open, hook in the suffocating heat of August 1945, Tokyo was a city of shadows and secrets. Above ground, the once bustling capital was reduced to a landscape of ruins, charred timbers, shattered glass, and streets eerily silent except for the distant drone of Allied bombers. But beneath the surface, in the fortified depths of the imperial palace, a handful of men gathered in a room heavy with dread. The fate of an entire nation and perhaps the world hung on the words spoken in that hidden chamber. For over a decade, Japan's empire had seemed unstoppable. Its armies had swept across Asia, its navy had ruled the Pacific, and its people had been taught that surrender was a fate worse than death. But now the empire was crumbling. Cities that once glowed with lantern light were now nothing but ashes. The navy, once the pride of the nation, lay silent on the ocean floor. Soldiers who had marched with banners and songs were now starving, cut off or desperately retreating. The dream of eternal glory had become a nightmare of hunger, fear, and loss. Yet even as the world outside burned, the men in the palace could not agree on what to do next. Some clung to the old code of honor, insisting that Japan must fight to the last man, no matter the cost. Others, haunted by the endless destruction, begged for peace before there was nothing left to save. Between them stood a figure almost mythic in his silence, Emperor Hirohito, a man who had never before spoken directly to his people, and whose word was law. For years he had been a distant symbol, worshipped, obeyed, but rarely heard. Now, as the empire teetered on the edge of oblivion, all eyes turned to him. Outside the palace walls, rumors swirled like smoke. Some whispered that the Americans had unleashed a weapon beyond imagination, a single bomb that could erase a city in a flash of light. Others feared the Soviets, whose armies were now crashing through the last defenses in the north. Across the country, families waited in terror, not knowing if the next sunrise would bring peace or annihilation. In the barracks and trenches, soldiers wondered if they would ever see home again, or if they would be ordered to die in a final, hopeless battle. Inside that underground room, the debate raged through the night. Voices rose and fell, tempers flared, and the weight of history pressed down on every word. No one wanted to be the first to speak of surrender. No one wanted to bear the shame of defeat. But as the hours passed, it became clear that something had changed. The old certainties were gone. The empire was dying and the world was watching. What could possibly force a nation built on the promise of victory to accept the unthinkable? What secret struggles, betrayals, and desperate gambles played out behind those closed doors? And how did a single voice, heard for the first time by an entire nation, bring an age of war to its knees? The answer to these questions begins not with a battle, but with a choice made in darkness, as the fate of Japan hung by a thread. And the story of that choice would echo far beyond the ruins of Tokyo, shaping the world for generations to come. Japan on the brink. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. The empire that had once stretched from the icy plains of Manchuria to the tropical islands of the Pacific was now reduced to a battered homeland, surrounded by enemies and haunted by the consequences of its own ambitions. The devastation was everywhere. Allied bombers had turned 66 cities into smoldering ruins. Tokyo, once a city of wooden houses and vibrant markets, had been transformed into a wasteland of blackened rubble. In a single night that March, over 100,000 civilians perished as firestorms swept through the capital, leaving nothing but ashes and silence. The countryside fared little better. Fields that once yielded rice and vegetables now lay barren, pockmarked by craters and littered with the wreckage of war. Food was scarce, rationed in ever smaller portions. Children lined up for hours for a handful of rice or a few sweet potatoes. Mothers traded family heirlooms for scraps of bread. Hunger gnawed at the nation's spirit, and the promise of victory that once filled the airwaves was now replaced by a grim, unspoken question. How much longer could this go on? Yet, even as the country starved, the machinery of government continued to turn. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known as the Big Six, met in secret, their faces drawn and voices tense. The council was split down the middle. On one side stood the moderates, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, who argued that Japan must seek a way out before total destruction. They saw the writing on the wall. The Allies were closing in from every direction, and the cost of continued resistance would be nothing less than the annihilation of the nation. On the other side were the hardliners, men like War Minister General Korichika Anami, who believed that surrender was a fate worse than death. To them, the very idea of laying down arms was unthinkable, a betrayal of everything Japan stood for. This division at the top mirrored the confusion and despair spreading through the ranks below. Soldiers once filled with pride and purpose now found themselves cut off, starving, and surrounded. Some units, isolated on distant islands or deep in the jungles of Asia, had not heard from Tokyo in months. Supplies had stopped coming. Ammunition was running out. Disease and malnutrition claimed more lives than enemy bullets. And yet the order to fight on remained. Surrender was forbidden, and the shame of capture was drilled into every recruit from the moment they donned a uniform. Despite all this, the government clung to the illusion of control. Propaganda broadcasts insisted that Japan would never surrender, that a final decisive battle would turn the tide. Posters urged citizens to prepare for invasion, to fight with bamboo spears if necessary. School children were drilled in air raid procedures, and women were told to defend their homes to the last breath. The reality, however, was far more desperate. The country was running out of everything: food, fuel, hope. The only thing in abundance was uncertainty. As the summer dragged on, the tension in Tokyo became unbearable. Every day brought new rumors, new fears. Would the Americans invade? Would the Soviets attack from the north? Would the emperor himself finally speak? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain. The old Japan was dying, and no one knew what would rise from its ashes. But the illusion of control was about to be shattered forever. The next blow would come not from within, but from the sky, a force so powerful that it would change the course of history in a single, blinding instant. The atomic bombs and Soviet invasion, the illusion that Japan could somehow endure, that the war could be fought to a more honorable conclusion, was obliterated in a single blinding flash. On August 6, 1945, as the sun rose over Hiroshima, a lone American bomber appeared in the sky. Few paid it much attention. Air raids had become a grim routine. But what followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In an instant, the city vanished beneath a mushroom cloud, its heart consumed by a fire hotter than the surface of the sun. The blast flattened buildings, vaporized steel, and left tens of thousands of people erased from existence. Survivors staggered through the ruins, their skin burned and eyes blinded, unable to comprehend what had happened. The word bomb no longer seemed adequate. This was something else, something monstrous. At first, the news in Tokyo was confused and incomplete. Reports spoke of a new weapon, a single device that had destroyed an entire city. Some in the high command dismissed it as American propaganda, a psychological trick meant to break their will. But then came the photographs, the eyewitness accounts, the undeniable evidence that Hiroshima had been wiped off the map in a matter of seconds. The shock rippled through the government, but even then, hope flickered in the minds of the hardliners. Maybe the Americans had only one such bomb. Maybe this was their last desperate gamble. That hope lasted just 3 days. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, unleashing the same unimaginable destruction. The city's hills and valleys, once alive with factories and homes, were reduced to a wasteland of twisted metal and scorched earth. The death toll soared, and the survivors' stories grew even more harrowing. The message was clear: the Americans could destroy any city at any time with a single plane. There was no defense, no way to fight back. The psychological impact was devastating. For a nation raised on the belief that spirit and sacrifice could overcome any enemy, the atomic bomb was a nightmare made real, a force that rendered courage and honor meaningless in the face of total annihilation. But the blows did not end there. On the very same day that Nagasaki burned, another disaster struck from the north. The Soviet Union, which had remained neutral for most of the war, suddenly declared war on Japan. Within hours, Soviet tanks and artillery thundered across the borders of Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese defenses with brutal efficiency. The Kwantung Army, once considered the pride of the empire, collapsed in the face of the Soviet onslaught. Entire divisions surrendered or were wiped out. The last hope that Japan might negotiate a separate peace with the Soviets vanished overnight. For the leaders in Tokyo, the situation was now beyond desperate. The twin catastrophes of atomic destruction and Soviet invasion shattered any remaining illusions of control. The hardliners, who had insisted that Japan could still fight on, found themselves cornered by reality. The moderates, who had pleaded for peace, now had the evidence they needed to argue that further resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. The emperor's advisors, once divided, now faced a simple, terrible truth: the nation was defenseless. And every day of delay meant more death, more suffering, and the possible extinction of Japan itself. As the fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still smoldered, and as Soviet tanks rolled ever closer, the leaders of Japan faced a choice unlike any in their history. Would they cling to the old ideals and risk total destruction, or would they find the courage to end the war, no matter the cost to their pride? The answer would come not from the battlefield, but from the heart of the imperial palace, where the fate of a nation and the world hung in the balance. The emperor's decision, inside the fortified walls of the imperial palace. As the world outside reeled from the devastation of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet onslaught, Japan's leaders faced a crisis unlike any in their nation's history. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six, sat in tense, sleepless debate, their faces drawn and voices hoarse from hours of argument. The stakes could not have been higher. Every man in that room knew that the next decision would determine not only the fate of the empire, but the survival of millions. The council was hopelessly divided. On one side, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai pleaded for peace. They pointed to the devastation wrought by the atomic bombs, the unstoppable Soviet advance, and the collapse of Japan's defenses. To them, the only hope for survival was to accept the Allies' terms, as outlined in the Potsdam Declaration. This meant unconditional surrender, a word that tasted like ash, but which now seemed the only way to save what remained of the nation. On the other side, War Minister General Korichika Anami and his allies refused to yield. They spoke of honor, of the sacred duty to fight on, no matter the odds. Surrender, they insisted, would mean the destruction of the imperial institution, the humiliation of the nation, and the loss of everything that made Japan unique. They clung to the hope that a final, desperate battle on the home islands might force the Allies to offer better terms. To them, death was preferable to dishonor. The debate raged through the night, voices rising and falling, tempers flaring and then falling into exhausted silence. No one dared to make the final decision. The fear of being remembered as the man who surrendered Japan haunted every member of the council. The shame of defeat, drilled into them since childhood, was almost unbearable. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The empire was dying, and every hour of delay brought new suffering. As dawn approached, the deadlock seemed unbreakable. The council had reached the limits of its authority, and the fate of the nation hung in the balance. Then, in a moment that would change the course of history, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki did something unprecedented. He turned to the emperor himself, a figure so revered, so distant, that few had ever heard his voice. "Your Majesty," Suzuki said quietly, "we await your decision." For a moment, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Emperor Hirohito, a man who had been raised as a living god, whose word was law but who had rarely intervened in the affairs of state. Now, with the empire in ruins and the world watching, he spoke. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of centuries. "I have given careful thought to the situation," he said. "To continue the war can only result in the destruction of our nation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. I wish to make peace." The impact of those words was immediate and profound. Ministers who had argued for endless resistance bowed their heads in silence. The emperor's decision was final. There could be no more debate. For the first time in history, the fate of Japan had been decided not by generals or politicians, but by the emperor himself. But even in surrender, there was a desperate hope to preserve something of the old Japan. On August 10th, the government sent a message through neutral Switzerland and Sweden, offering to accept the Allies' terms on one condition, that the emperor be allowed to remain as the sovereign ruler of Japan. It was a plea for mercy, a last attempt to save the heart of the nation. In Washington, President Truman and his advisors faced their own dilemma. Some demanded unconditional surrender as promised to the American people. Others, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson, warned that removing the emperor could shatter Japanese society and make occupation impossible. After tense debate, the United States replied with carefully chosen words: Hirohito could remain, but only under the authority of the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. It was a subtle compromise, allowing both sides to save face, yet even as the path to peace seemed to open, danger still lurked in the shadows. Within the Japanese military, outrage simmered. Many officers saw the emperor's decision as a betrayal, an unthinkable abandonment of honor. For men raised to believe that death was preferable to surrender, the thought of laying down arms was intolerable. As negotiations continued, extremists began to plot in secret, determined to prevent the emperor's announcement from ever reaching the people. The fate of Japan now rested on a fragile hope and a single, unprecedented decision. But the struggle was far from over. In the darkness of the coming nights, a new threat would emerge, one that could plunge the nation into chaos before peace could take hold. Mutiny in the shadows as the world waited for Japan's answer. A storm of anger and betrayal brewed within the heart of the Japanese military. The emperor's decision to seek peace sent shockwaves through the ranks, especially among those who had been raised to believe that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. For many officers, the idea that the sacred emperor would call for an end to the war was not just unthinkable, it was intolerable. In the shadows of the imperial palace, a desperate plot began to take shape. One that threatened to plunge Japan into civil war at the very moment peace was within reach. The seeds of rebellion were sown in whispered conversations and secret meetings. Young officers, fueled by a mix of fanatic loyalty and fear of humiliation, could not accept the idea of surrender. They saw the emperor's decision as a betrayal of everything they had been taught to honor. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed that the government had been infiltrated by traitors, others that the emperor was being manipulated or held against his will. The truth mattered less than the sense of outrage and desperation that now gripped the military's most radical elements. At the center of this brewing mutiny was Major Kenji Hatanaka, a passionate and determined officer who believed it was his duty to save Japan from disgrace. Hatanaka and his co-conspirators were convinced that if they could just stop the surrender announcement, the nation would rally for one last glorious battle. Their plan was bold and reckless. Seize the imperial palace, destroy the recording of the emperor's speech, and arrest the ministers who supported peace. In their minds, this was not treason, but the highest form of loyalty, a final stand to preserve the soul of Japan. In the early hours of August 15th, as most of Tokyo slept, Hatanaka and his followers made their move. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped into the palace grounds, cutting phone lines and overpowering guards. The conspirators moved quickly, searching for the lacquer box that held the precious recording of the emperor's surrender speech. Every minute counted. If they could find and destroy the record before it was broadcast, they believed they could change the course of history. But the palace was a maze of corridors and locked doors, and confusion reigned. Some guards remained loyal to the emperor and resisted the coup, risking their lives to protect the recording. Ministers and palace staff hid in closets and storerooms, clutching the script that would end the war. The conspirators, growing desperate, interrogated anyone they found, demanding to know where the record was hidden. Tension mounted as dawn approached. The fate of the nation hung on a single fragile disk of lacquer, and the outcome was anything but certain. Outside the palace, the city was eerily quiet. Most citizens had no idea that a coup was underway. They waited anxiously for news, unaware that the peace they so desperately hoped for was in jeopardy. Inside, the conspirators' plans began to unravel. Some officers hesitated, unwilling to go against the emperor's explicit wishes. Others realized that the rest of the military was not joining the rebellion. The sense of unity that had driven the plot began to fracture. As the first light of morning crept over the ruined city, it became clear that the coup had failed. The loyalists had managed to hide the recording, and the conspirators found themselves surrounded and abandoned. Major Hatanaka, realizing that all was lost, walked out into the street outside the palace gates. In a final act of despair, he drew his pistol and ended his own life, leaving behind a note that read, "I have done all I could for my country." The failed coup, known as the Kyujo incident, was a last, desperate gasp of the old Japan, a final attempt to cling to the ideals of honor and sacrifice, even as the world changed forever. The plotters had gambled everything on the hope that they could turn back the tide of history, but in the end, their actions only underscored the depth of the nation's crisis. For a few tense hours, the fate of millions had hung by a thread, threatened not by foreign bombs or invading armies, but by the ghosts of Japan's own past. As the sun rose over Tokyo, the city remained silent, holding its breath. The recording of the emperor's voice, hidden and protected at great risk, was now ready to be broadcast. The mutiny had failed, but the scars it left behind would linger for years. The struggle for Japan's soul was not over, but the path to peace was now open, if only the nation could find the strength to listen. The voice that ended an era as. The first rays of sunlight crept over a battered Tokyo. The city was gripped by a silence unlike any it had known before. The failed coup had left the imperial palace tense but intact, and the precious recording of the emperor's surrender speech, hidden, protected, and nearly lost, was now ready to be broadcast. For the first time in history, the Japanese people would hear the voice of their emperor, not as a distant divine figure, but as a man speaking directly to his nation in its darkest hour. Across Japan, radios crackled to life. In homes reduced to rubble, in crowded shelters, in military barracks and remote outposts, millions gathered in silence, straining to catch every word. The air was thick with anxiety and disbelief. Some refused to believe the rumors that the war was truly ending. Others, exhausted by years of loss and fear, clung to a fragile hope that peace might finally be at hand. No one knew exactly what to expect. The emperor's voice had always been shrouded in mystery, reserved for ceremonies and rituals, never for the ears of ordinary people. At precisely noon on August 15, 1945, the broadcast began. The recording was faint, formal, and delivered in archaic Japanese that few could fully understand. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. "To our good and loyal subjects," Emperor Hirohito intoned, "the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb that had caused immeasurable damage and of the need to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he called upon his people to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. For a moment, time seemed to stop. In cities and villages, on distant islands and in foreign lands, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike listened in stunned silence. Some wept openly, overcome by grief and relief. Others fell to their knees, praying or simply bowing their heads in resignation. There were those who refused to accept what they had heard, convinced that the emperor's words must be some kind of code or trick. But as the reality sank in, the truth became impossible to deny. The war was over. The reactions were as varied as the people themselves. In some places, soldiers threw down their rifles and wept. The burden of years of fighting finally lifted. In others, officers struggled to maintain order, fearing chaos or even mass suicide among troops unwilling to accept defeat. Civilians burned their flags, symbols of a vanished empire, while others clung to them as reminders of a world that no longer existed. In Manchuria, Korea, China, and the scattered islands of the Pacific, millions of Japanese troops received the order to cease fighting. Not all obeyed. Isolated units, cut off from communication or unwilling to believe the news, continued to resist for days or even weeks. For some, the war would never truly end. The emotional impact of the emperor's address was profound. For generations, Hirohito had been more myth than man, a living god whose will was absolute, whose presence was felt but never heard. Now, stripped of divine mystery, his voice carried both the weight of defeat and the promise of survival. He did not offer easy answers or false hope. Instead, he asked his people to accept the unimaginable, to endure suffering for the sake of a future they could not yet see. As the news spread, the world outside Japan reacted with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. In Allied capitals, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets in celebration. In New York's Times Square, sailors kissed strangers and confetti rained from the sky. In London, fireworks lit up the night. But even in victory, there was a sense of mourning, a recognition of the terrible cost of the war, and the millions who would never return home. Back in Japan, the emperor's voice continued to echo in the minds of his people. The old world had ended, not with a final battle, but with a single unforgettable broadcast. The nation now faced an uncertain future, its fate no longer in its own hands. The surrender was not just the end of a war, but the end of an era, a moment when the impossible became reality, and a new Japan was forced to imagine what might come next. Surrender and occupation. The emperor's voice had barely faded from the airwaves when the machinery of surrender began to move. Across the battered islands of Japan, the news spread with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. For some, the end of the war was a blessing, a long-awaited reprieve from fear and hunger. For others, it was a humiliation so deep that words could barely express it. But whether welcomed or mourned, the reality was inescapable. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling Asia now faced the unthinkable task of submitting to its conquerors. The world watched as the formalities of surrender unfolded with a precision that seemed almost surreal. On August 19th, a delegation of Japanese officers, their uniforms immaculate but their faces grim, boarded a plane for the Philippines. Their destination, a meeting with General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers. For the Japanese, it was a journey into the unknown. For the Allies, it was the first step toward ending a conflict that had consumed the globe. MacArthur, a figure as controversial as he was commanding, made it clear that the surrender would be more than a simple exchange of documents. It would be a spectacle, a moment designed to show the world that the age of Japanese militarism was over. The chosen stage was the USS Missouri, a massive American battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay. On September 2, 1945, under a pale morning sky, the Missouri became the setting for one of history's most iconic ceremonies. The scene was almost theatrical in its symbolism. A silent armada of 250 Allied warships surrounded the Missouri, their guns pointed not in anger, but as a reminder of the power that had brought Japan to its knees. On the deck, representatives from every Allied nation stood in solemn ranks: Americans, British, Soviets, Chinese, Australians, French, and more. The Japanese delegation arrived in black morning coats and white gloves, their movements stiff and formal. At their head was Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, walking with a cane, his leg lost years earlier in an assassination attempt. Beside him stood General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, his face a mask of stoic resignation. General MacArthur, tall and composed in his open khaki shirt and sunglasses, addressed the assembly with words that echoed across the bay. "It is my earnest hope," he declared, "that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge, a world founded upon faith and understanding." The moment was heavy with both triumph and tragedy. At 9:04 a.m., Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the emperor and the Japanese government. Umezu followed, signing for the Imperial General Staff. Then MacArthur stepped forward, signing for the Allied powers, followed by representatives of each nation. At 9:08, the war was officially over. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. In Tokyo Bay, sailors cheered and wept, planes roared overhead in salute, and the world exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. For those who had survived Pearl Harbor, Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the moment felt almost unreal. The war that had begun with a surprise attack and raged across continents and oceans had ended not with a final battle, but with a few strokes of a pen. But for Japan, surrender was not simply an end. It was the beginning of a transformation more profound than anyone could have imagined. Within days, American troops began landing on Japanese soil not as conquerors, but as administrators. Under MacArthur's command, the occupation of Japan would become one of the most ambitious experiments in nation-building the world had ever seen. The changes came swiftly and touched every corner of society. The once mighty Japanese military was dissolved, its leaders stripped of power and many arrested as war criminals. The emperor, once worshipped as a living god, was compelled to renounce his divine status in a radio address that stunned the nation. War crimes trials began in Tokyo, with 7 high-ranking officials, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, ultimately sentenced to death. A new constitution drafted under Allied supervision renounced war forever and granted universal suffrage, giving women the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. For ordinary Japanese, the years after surrender were a time of hardship and uncertainty. The economy was in ruins, cities lay in rubble, and food was desperately scarce. Black markets flourished, and the countryside struggled to feed itself. Hunger and poverty became daily realities, and the shame of defeat hung heavy in the air. Yet amid the ashes, something remarkable began to take shape. The old structures of power and privilege were dismantled, and a new society, one built on peace, democracy, and innovation, slowly emerged. The legacy and lingering questions. The surrender of Japan was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new and uncertain era, both for the Japanese people and for the world. The shockwaves from those final days in 1945 rippled far beyond the ruined cities and devastated countryside, shaping the destinies of nations and the lives of millions. Even now, decades later, the legacy of Japan's defeat continues to spark debate, reflection, and sometimes even controversy. One of the most enduring questions is whether the atomic bombings were truly necessary. Historians, generals, and survivors have argued for generations about the decision to unleash such devastating weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some claim that the bombs forced Japan's surrender and saved countless lives by avoiding a bloody invasion of the home islands. Others insist that Japan was already on the brink of collapse, and that the bombings were an unnecessary tragedy, an act that left deep scars on the national psyche and cast a long shadow over the post-war world. The debate is far from settled, and the images of ruined cities and suffering survivors remain some of the most haunting in human history. But the legacy of Japan's surrender is not just about destruction. It is also about transformation. The end of the war marked the collapse of the old order in Asia. Japan's defeat shattered the myth of imperial invincibility and brought an abrupt end to its colonial ambitions. Across the continent, the vacuum left by the fallen empire ignited a wave of change. In China, the civil war between nationalists and communists resumed with renewed ferocity, eventually leading to the rise of Mao Zedong and the founding of the People's Republic. In Korea, liberation from Japanese rule quickly gave way to division and conflict, setting the stage for decades of tension between North and South. In Southeast Asia, nationalist movements surged against returning European powers, sparking struggles for independence in Vietnam, Indonesia, and beyond. For Japan itself, the years after surrender were marked by both hardship and hope. The trauma of defeat was everywhere, visible in the ruins of cities, the faces of returning soldiers, and the empty chairs at family tables. Yet amid the ashes, a new Japan began to take shape. The American occupation, led by General MacArthur, imposed sweeping reforms. The military was dismantled, war criminals were tried, and a new constitution enshrined democracy and renounced war forever. Women gained the right to vote, and the foundations of a modern welfare state were laid. The emperor, once revered as a living god, became a symbol of continuity rather than divinity, a living link between the old Japan and the new. The transformation was not without pain. For many, the loss of empire and the humiliation of defeat were wounds that would never fully heal. Some former soldiers and officials struggled to find their place in a society that no longer valued the ideals they had fought for. Others, especially those who had suffered under Japanese rule in Asia, demanded justice and remembrance. The war crimes trials in Tokyo brought some measure of accountability, but also left lingering questions about responsibility and forgiveness. Yet, out of the devastation, Japan rose with astonishing speed. Within a generation, the country had rebuilt its cities, revived its economy, and emerged as a global leader in technology and trade. The same factories that once produced weapons of war now turned out cars, radios, and televisions. The spirit of innovation and resilience became the new face of Japan, and the phrase, "never again," replaced the old cries of conquest. Still, the echoes of the past have never fully faded. In the Pacific, rusting ships and sunken planes remain as silent witnesses to the conflict. In the jungles of Burma and the islands of Micronesia, the bones of the fallen still lie beneath the soil. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki gather each year to remember the light that ended their world, and to warn future generations of the dangers of unchecked power. The legacy of Japan's surrender is also a story of remembrance. August 15th, the day the emperor's voice ended the war, is not celebrated with fireworks or parades. Instead, it is marked by silence, reflection, and the quiet bowing of heads at memorials across the country. The emperor, no longer divine but still revered, pays his respects at Yasukuni Shrine, honoring the memory of the war dead. For many Japanese, the day is a time to mourn what was lost, to reflect on the cost of war, and to renew a commitment to peace. Conclusion. The story of Japan's surrender is more than a chapter in the history books. It's a mirror reflecting the deepest struggles of humanity, pride and humility, destruction and rebirth, memory and hope. As the echoes of Emperor Hirohito's voice faded into the humid air of that August afternoon, a nation stood at the crossroads of its own existence. The empire that had once promised eternal glory had perished in fire and ruin. But from those ashes, something unprecedented began to take shape. For the Japanese people, the end of the war was not a moment of celebration, but of mourning and reckoning. The date, August 15th, became a day of silence, not triumph, a time to remember the millions lost, the cities destroyed, and the dreams that vanished in the flames. Each year, as the emperor bows before the memorial at Yasukuni Shrine, the country pauses to reflect on the cost of ambition and the price of peace. The wounds of war run deep, and the memories of suffering are passed down from generation to generation, shaping the nation's identity in ways that are both visible and invisible. Yet, out of that collective grief, Japan found the strength to reinvent itself. The years of occupation and reconstruction were marked by hardship and uncertainty, but also by a remarkable spirit of resilience. The old hierarchies were dismantled, and a new constitution laid the foundation for democracy, equality, and the renunciation of war. Factories that once produced weapons of destruction were transformed into engines of innovation, powering an economic miracle that would astonish the world. Within a single generation, Japan rose from the ruins to become a symbol of peace, prosperity, and technological progress. But the transformation was not just material, it was spiritual. The Japanese people, once taught to worship the emperor as a living god, learned to see him as a human being, fallible and mortal. The myth of divine kingship gave way to a new sense of national purpose, rooted not in conquest, but in cooperation and creativity. The phrase "never again" became a guiding principle, shaping foreign policy, education, and the collective consciousness of a nation determined to avoid the mistakes of the past. The legacy of Japan's surrender extends far beyond its borders. Across Asia, the collapse of the empire ignited movements for independence and self-determination, redrawing the map of the continent and setting the stage for new conflicts and alliances. The atomic bombings, with their unimaginable destruction, forced the world to confront the terrifying power of science unleashed without restraint. The debates over necessity, morality, and responsibility continue to this day, reminding us that history is not just a record of what happened, but a conversation about what could have been. And yet, for all the suffering and loss, the story of Japan's surrender is ultimately one of hope. It is a testament to the human capacity for change, for learning, and for building something new from the ruins of the old. The same people who once shouted banzai in the name of empire now lead the world in technology, culture, and peace-building. The same cities that were reduced to ashes now shine as beacons of resilience and renewal. But the lessons of 1945 are not confined to the past. In a world still haunted by the specter of war, division, and unchecked ambition, Japan's journey offers a powerful reminder that even the greatest tragedies can give birth to new beginnings, and that the choices we make in our darkest hours can shape the future for generations to come. So as we look back on the end of the war, we are left with questions that have no easy answers. What is the true cost of peace? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered while forging a path toward reconciliation and understanding? And perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated? The story of Japan's surrender is not just a tale of defeat, but of transformation, a reminder that history is always in motion and that the end of one era is only the beginning of another. In the quiet moments of remembrance, as the world pauses to reflect on the events of 1945, we are called to remember not just what was lost, but what was gained, the chance to build a better, more peaceful world.